Standing in the marble hallway of the federal courthouse in downtown Atlanta, I stared at the legal documents trembling in my hands. My own parents had filed a lawsuit claiming I was mentally unfit to inherit my grandmother's $10 million estate. 28 years of their complete neglect, and now they wanted my money. They'd spent decades focusing solely on my golden child brother while I scraped by working 3 jobs. Today they claimed I couldn't handle Grandma Eleanor's fortune responsibly. The bailiff's voice echoed through the corridor, calling my case number. I walked into the courtroom where my parents sat smirking confidently beside their expensive attorney. But when Judge Harrison looked up and saw my face, his gavel clattered to the floor in absolute shock. Growing up in the affluent suburbs of Buckhead, I learned early that love was conditional in the Morrison household. My father, David, a successful insurance executive, and my mother, Patricia, a real estate agent, poured every ounce of attention into my older brother, Ryan. He was their shining star, 6 feet 2 inches tall with perfect teeth, captain of the varsity football team, and everything they'd ever dreamed of in a child. I was the afterthought, the mistake they never quite knew how to handle. While Ryan received a brand new Ford Mustang for his 16th birthday, I got a lecture about fiscal responsibility. When he needed $20,000 for his first year at Georgia Tech, they wrote the check without hesitation. When I asked for help with community college tuition, they suggested I apply for student loans. Lorna needs to learn independence, my mother would say, adjusting her pearl necklace with that dismissive wave of her manicured hand. Ryan has natural leadership qualities. He'll need our investment to reach his potential. I worked at a coffee shop before school stocked shelves at a grocery store in the afternoons and cleaned office buildings on weekends. Every dollar went toward my education at Atlanta Metropolitan State College. My parents attended every single one of Ryan's football games, cheering from the 50-yard line in their matching team jerseys. They never once asked about my grades or showed up to my graduation ceremony. But sitting in that courtroom today, watching Judge Thomas Harrison's face drain of all color as he stared at me, I realized something extraordinary was happening, something my parents could never have anticipated. The judge's hands shook slightly as he set down his reading glasses. His voice came out as barely a whisper. "Counselor, could we have a brief recess? I need to verify something in my records." My parents exchanged confused glances. Their attorney, Marcus Steinfeld, a man whose $500 hourly rate was legendary throughout Georgia, looked equally baffled. "Your Honor, we're prepared to proceed immediately." Steinfeld said, his silver hair gleaming under the fluorescent lights. "My clients have substantial evidence regarding Miss Morrison's inability to manage such a significant inheritance." Judge Harrison stood abruptly, his black robes billowing. 15-minute recess. Everyone remained seated. He disappeared into his chambers, leaving behind a courtroom thick with tension and my parents' mounting irritation. What they didn't know, what they could never have imagined, was that Judge Harrison recognized me for a very specific reason. 5 years ago, I wasn't Lorna Morrison, struggling community college graduate. I was Laura Chen Morrison, the pharmaceutical industry whistleblower who testified before Congress about the massive corruption scandal that sent dozens of executives to federal prison. After receiving death threats from powerful pharmaceutical companies whose illegal practices I'd exposed, I'd legally changed my name and disappeared into witness protection. The quiet life I'd built working as a medical records clerk was my sanctuary from the chaos that heroism had brought into my world. My parents had been so focused on Ryan's achievements and their own social climbing that they'd never bothered following national news closely enough to connect their overlooked daughter with the brave woman who dominated headlines for months. But Judge Harrison remembered. He'd been the federal judge who'd protected my identity during the most dangerous phase of my testimony. He'd seen pharmaceutical company executives try to intimidate me, watched me stand firm against threats that would have broken most people, and witnessed my unwavering commitment to protecting patients from deadly drugs that companies knew were dangerous. As the recess stretched on, I could feel my parents' frustration building. Patricia kept checking her diamond-encrusted watch, while David drummed his fingers impatiently on the polished wooden table. "This is ridiculous," my mother hissed to their lawyer. "We have 3 expert psychological evaluations stating that she's mentally unstable. Her gambling problems alone should disqualify her from handling this inheritance." I almost laughed out loud. Gambling problems. They'd fabricated an entire addiction to justify stealing my grandmother's money. These were the people who'd raised me, and they knew so little about who I actually was that they could invent wholesale lies about my character without a moment's hesitation. The truth was, I'd never placed so much as a $5 bet in my entire life. My grandmother Eleanor had raised me to be cautious with money, practical and thoughtful about every financial decision. She'd been the only adult in my childhood who'd shown genuine interest in my well-being, who'd listened to my dreams and encouraged my studies. When Judge Harrison returned to the bench, his entire demeanor had transformed. Gone was the routine efficiency of a judge handling a standard inheritance dispute. Instead, he carried himself with the gravity of someone who understood exactly what was happening in his courtroom. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying new authority, "this case involves circumstances that require very careful consideration. We'll be proceeding with unusual protocols due to factors that have just come to my attention." My father leaned forward, confusion creasing his forehead. "Your Honor, we simply want to protect our family's interests. Our daughter has demonstrated a pattern of poor judgment that makes her unsuitable to manage such substantial assets." Judge Harrison's eyes settled on me with something that looked remarkably like respect. "Miss Morrison, would you please approach the bench for a private consultation?" As I walked forward on unsteady legs, I caught my mother's sharp whisper to Steinfeld, "What's happening here? This should be straightforward." Their attorney's confidence was beginning to crack around the edges. "Your Honor, perhaps we could expedite these proceedings. My clients have substantial documentation supporting their position." But Judge Harrison was already gesturing for me to step closer, and in that moment I knew my carefully constructed new life was about to collide spectacularly with my past. The question was whether it would save me or destroy everything I'd worked to build since leaving witness protection. The irony was perfect. My parents, who'd spent years dismissing me as their worthless failure of a daughter, had accidentally sued someone whose courage and integrity had already been tested in the highest courts of the land. They were about to discover that the child they'd ignored had grown into a woman capable of facing down corruption at the highest levels. But the biggest shock was yet to come, and it would change everything they thought they knew about both me and the inheritance they were so desperately trying to steal. Eleanor Morrison had been the one constant source of love in my childhood chaos. While my parents obsessed over Ryan's football statistics and social achievements, my grandmother quietly built a relationship with me that would span decades and ultimately change everything. Every Saturday morning for 23 years, I'd drive to Sunset Manor Nursing Home to spend time with the woman who'd actually raised me in all the ways that mattered. She'd moved there not because she needed extensive care, but because she'd grown tired of the loneliness in her enormous Ansley Park mansion after my grandfather's death. "Lorna, sweetheart," she'd say, patting the chair beside her hospital bed, "tell me what you've been reading this week." Unlike my parents, who'd never shown interest in my academic pursuits, Grandma Eleanor hung on every word of my college courses. She'd attended Spelman College in the 1950s, studying business at a time when women rarely entered corporate environments. Her sharp mind had helped my grandfather build a small construction company into a real estate empire that spanned 3 states. During those final months before her death, while my parents claimed they were too busy with Ryan's wedding preparations to visit regularly, Eleanor shared secrets with me that would have stunned our entire family. "People see the $10 million in my will and think that's everything," she said one rainy afternoon, her weathered hands holding mine with surprising strength. "But that's just what I wanted them to see, darling. The real estate holdings, the investment portfolios, the commercial properties that's all hidden in trusts, and corporate structures your father could never understand. My grandmother had spent 40 years quietly building an empire worth over $50 million. The construction business had been just the beginning. She'd purchased abandoned warehouses in up-and-coming neighborhoods, invested in small technology companies before they went public, and bought farmland that later became suburban developments. Why hide it? I'd asked, genuinely confused about her secrecy. Eleanor's laugh was both bitter and knowing. Because your parents would have tried to control me if they'd known the real numbers. They'd have put me in the cheapest facility they could find while fighting over money I hadn't even died yet to leave behind. She'd been absolutely right. David and Patricia had visited her exactly 4 times in her final year, always bringing legal documents they hoped she'd sign without reading carefully. They'd suggested moving her to a state-funded facility that cost $800 less per month, claiming it had better recreational programs. But the most shocking revelation came 3 weeks before her death, when Eleanor pulled out a smartphone I'd never seen her use before. "I've been recording conversations," she admitted, showing me dozens of audio files labeled with dates and names. "Your parents don't know I understand technology better than they think I do." The recordings were devastating. Hours of David and Patricia discussing how they'd finally get rid of that worthless daughter once they inherited Eleanor's money. Detailed conversations about forging documents, lying to physicians about her mental capacity, and even selecting a substandard nursing facility where she'd decline more quickly. "They wanted to speed things along," Eleanor said quietly, her voice heavy with the pain of betrayal. "My own son was calculating how much money he'd save on my care if I died 6 months earlier than expected. But Eleanor had prepared for their greed with the cunning of someone who'd spent decades outmaneuvering business competitors. Hidden within the complex legal language of her will was a clause that none of them had bothered reading past the first page. "If anyone contests your inheritance through legal action," she explained, "they automatically forfeit their own separate bequests. David and Patricia are each supposed to receive $5 million from different trusts. But the moment they filed that lawsuit, they lost everything." The mathematical beauty was perfect. By trying to steal my $10 million, they'd lost their own $10 million. Their greed had cost them twice what they'd hoped to gain, and they had no idea because they'd been too arrogant to read the entire document. "But why leave me anything at all?" I'd asked. "You could have given everything to charity and avoided this whole mess." Eleanor's eyes sparkled with the mischief that had made her such a successful businesswoman. "Because you're the only one who visited me without wanting something, darling. You're the only one who inherited my actual values instead of just expecting my money." She'd been right about my parents' predictable behavior. Within hours of her funeral, they were meeting with estate attorneys and financial advisors, calculating how quickly they could access their inheritance. They'd spent exactly 0 time grieving and considerable effort planning how to spend money they hadn't even received yet. Patricia had already put deposits down on a Mediterranean cruise and a BMW convertible. David had started researching investment properties in Florida and golf club memberships that cost more than most people's annual salaries. But their biggest mistake had been underestimating me. They'd been so focused on their image of me as the struggling, unsuccessful daughter that they'd never bothered learning who I'd actually become. They had no idea that I'd testified before Congress that I'd faced down pharmaceutical executives worth billions of dollars, or that I'd already proven my ability to handle pressure that would have destroyed weaker people. Sitting in that courtroom watching their confident smirks as they prepared to steal my inheritance, I couldn't help thinking about Eleanor's final words to me. "Lorna, you've already proven your courage by standing up to people far more powerful than your parents. This inheritance isn't about money, it's about justice. Use it to build the life you deserve, and don't let their decades of neglect make you doubt your worth for even 1 minute." Judge Harrison's recognition had been the first crack in their carefully constructed legal strategy. But they had no idea how many more surprises were waiting for them, or how thoroughly their greed was about to backfire in ways they could never have imagined. The woman they'd dismissed as a failure was about to show them exactly what kind of strength Eleanor Morrison had recognized and rewarded, and their expensive lawyer was about to discover that some battles can't be won with money alone, especially when you're fighting someone who's already proven their integrity on a national stage. As Judge Harrison called us back into session, I could see uncertainty beginning to creep into my parents' expressions. But the real shocks were still coming, and each one would hit harder than the last. Marcus Steinfeld commanded the courtroom like a general surveying a battlefield. He was certain he'd already won. His $1,000 suit was perfectly tailored, his silver hair impeccably styled, and his reputation for crushing opposition in inheritance disputes was legendary throughout the Southeast. "Your Honor." He began, his voice carrying the smooth authority of someone who'd never lost a case this straightforward. "My clients have substantial evidence demonstrating Miss Morrison's complete inability to responsibly manage a $10 million inheritance." He gestured toward a stack of documents that looked intimidatingly official. "We have 3 independent psychological evaluations confirming severe mental instability, documented gambling addictions, and a pattern of financial irresponsibility that puts this entire estate at risk." I watched my parents nodding along with every word, their expressions mixing satisfaction with barely concealed excitement. Patricia had worn her most expensive jewelry for the occasion, diamond earrings that cost more than I'd earned in 6 months, a pearl necklace that had belonged to her mother, and the wedding ring set that sparkled under the courtroom's fluorescent lighting. David sat straighter in his chair, projecting the confidence of a successful businessman who'd finally cornered a problem that had been irritating him for decades. To them, this was simply a matter of correcting an obvious mistake in Eleanor's judgment. Steinfeld continued his presentation with theatrical flair, holding up documents like evidence in a murder trial. Dr. Harrison Blackwell, a respected psychiatrist with 30 years of experience, has diagnosed Miss Morrison with severe depression and anxiety disorders that significantly impair her judgment. The first lie: I'd never met Dr. Blackwell in my life. Dr. Rebecca Walsh, a specialist in addiction psychology, has documented Miss Morrison's compulsive gambling behaviors and her inability to control spending impulses. The second fabrication: Dr. Walsh was a name they'd found in a medical directory. And Dr. Michael Stevens, a forensic psychologist who specializes in competency evaluations, has concluded that Miss Morrison poses a significant risk to herself and others if entrusted with substantial financial assets. The third complete invention: they'd created an entire alternate reality version of my mental health, confident that I lacked the resources to challenge their expert witnesses. But as Steinfeld spoke, I noticed Judge Harrison taking unusually detailed notes. His expression remained carefully neutral, but I caught him glancing at me with something that looked almost like anticipation. Furthermore, Steinfeld continued, warming to his performance, my clients have documented evidence of Miss Morrison's erratic behavior patterns, including frequent job changes, social isolation, and an inability to maintain stable relationships. My mother leaned forward slightly, adding her own theatrical touch to the proceedings. "Your Honor, we're heartbroken about Lorna's condition. We've tried for years to get her the help she needs, but she refuses treatment. We simply cannot stand by and watch her destroy herself with this inheritance." The performance was flawless. Patricia's voice carried just the right note of concerned maternal love mixed with desperate worry. If I hadn't known her for 28 years, I might have believed her myself. David nodded gravely, playing the role of the responsible father forced into an impossible situation. Eleanor was elderly and confused in her final months. She wasn't aware of Lorna's deteriorating mental state. We believe she would have made different arrangements if she'd understood the full situation. Judge Harrison set down his pen and studied the documents Steinfeld had submitted. The courtroom fell silent except for the humming of fluorescent lights and the distant sounds of traffic from the street below. "Mr. Steinfeld, The judge said, finally, "These psychological evaluations are quite detailed. When were these examinations conducted?" "Over the past 6 weeks, Your Honor. We wanted to ensure the most current and accurate assessments possible." And Miss Morrison was aware of these evaluations. She consented to the examinations. Steinfeld's pause lasted just a fraction of a second too long. "The evaluations were conducted using established protocols for competency assessments, Your Honor." It wasn't quite a lie, but it wasn't quite the truth either. They'd had me followed, photographed, and observed without my knowledge, then paid their experts to create diagnoses based on nothing more than speculation and their desired outcome. Judge Harrison turned his attention to me. "Miss Morrison, do you have legal representation?" "No, Your Honor, I'm representing myself." My parents' satisfaction was almost palpable. David whispered something to Patricia that made her cover a smile with her hand. They'd counted on my inability to afford quality legal help, certain that Steinfeld's reputation and resources would overwhelm any defense I could mount. "I see," Judge Harrison said thoughtfully. "This court takes competency challenges very seriously, especially when they involve substantial inheritances. However, I'm also concerned about the timing and methodology of these psychological evaluations." Steinfeld's confidence flickered almost imperceptibly. "Your Honor, my clients have acted with complete transparency and appropriate medical oversight." "Mr. Steinfeld, would you approach the bench, please?" As the attorney moved forward, Judge Harrison's voice dropped to a whisper that I couldn't quite hear. But I watched Steinfeld's expression change from confidence to confusion to something that looked remarkably like concern. When he returned to his table, his swagger had diminished noticeably. "Your Honor," Steinfeld said, his voice lacking its earlier certainty, "perhaps we could schedule a brief recess to review some procedural matters." "That won't be necessary," Judge Harrison replied. "However, I am going to require additional verification of these psychological evaluations before we proceed further." My mother's carefully composed expression began showing cracks around the edges. "Your Honor, we have 3 independent experts confirming our daughter's condition. How much more verification could possibly be needed?" Judge Harrison's smile was enigmatic. "Mrs. Morrison, this court has handled numerous cases involving questionable expert testimony. I want to ensure that all evaluations were conducted according to proper ethical and legal standards." David leaned over to whisper urgently in Steinfeld's ear, but their lawyer was studying his notes with the intensity of someone trying to solve an unexpected puzzle. What none of them knew was that Judge Harrison had spent the recess making phone calls. He'd contacted Dr. Blackwell, Dr. Walsh, and Dr. Stevens directly. 2 of them had never heard of me, and the third had been paid $5,000 to write a report based entirely on information provided by my parents. But the real surprise was still coming. That evening, as I sat in my small apartment reviewing Eleanor's will and trying to prepare for the next day's proceedings, my phone rang with a call that would change everything. "Miss Morrison, this is Marcus Steinfeld. I believe we need to discuss your situation privately." His voice carried none of the courtroom authority I'd witnessed earlier. Instead, he sounded like a man who'd discovered that his sure-thing case had hidden complexities he hadn't anticipated. "What do you want, Mr. Steinfeld?" "I want to make you an offer that could benefit both of us significantly. Your parents have promised me a substantial bonus if we win this case $2 million from your inheritance. But I'm prepared to throw the case in your favor if you're willing to pay me $3 million instead." The extortion attempt was so brazen that I almost laughed. This was the legendary Marcus Steinfeld reduced to trying to shake down the very person he'd been hired to destroy. "And if I refuse," his voice turned cold and threatening, "then I'll make sure this case destroys more than just your inheritance, Miss Morrison. I have connections throughout the legal community, and I can ensure that your reputation never recovers from the allegations we'll present. Gambling addiction, mental instability, financial irresponsibility. By the time I'm finished, no employer will touch you." "Is that a threat, Mr. Steinfeld?" "It's a promise." Pay me $3 million, or I'll make sure you spend the rest of your life regretting this conversation. As I hung up the phone, I realized that I wasn't just fighting my parents anymore. I was facing a corrupt legal system where attorneys would fabricate evidence and threaten extortion to line their own pockets. But Marcus Steinfeld had made a critical error in judgment. He'd threatened someone who'd already proven their willingness to stand up to far more powerful corruption than anything he could imagine. The pharmaceutical executives I'd faced down had threatened my life, not just my reputation. Government officials had tried to silence me with political pressure that would have ended most people's careers. Corporate lawyers with unlimited resources had spent months trying to discredit my testimony and destroy my credibility. If I could survive all of that and still tell the truth before Congress, then Marcus Steinfeld and my greedy parents were about to learn exactly what kind of opponent they'd chosen to fight. The battle was just beginning, and they had no idea how many allies I was about to discover or how thoroughly their own greed and corruption was about to expose them. Sarah Martinez found me the next morning in the courthouse cafeteria, staring at a cup of coffee I couldn't afford to drink while reviewing legal documents I barely understood. She was everything Marcus Steinfeld wasn't: young, idealistic, and genuinely committed to justice, rather than billable hours. Miss Morrison, I'm Sarah Martinez, public defender with the Georgia Legal Aid Society. I read about your case in yesterday's legal briefs, and I'd like to offer my services. She was maybe 30 years old with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and clothes that clearly came from department stores rather than designer boutiques. Her briefcase was worn leather instead of polished metal, and her shoes showed the scuff marks of someone who walked everywhere instead of being driven in luxury cars. I can't afford a lawyer. I admitted, embarrassed by the truth, but unwilling to lie about my financial situation. Sarah's smile was warm and genuine. That's exactly why organizations like mine exist. Your case has some unusual elements that concern me professionally, and I think you're facing challenges that no one should have to handle alone. She sat down across from me and pulled out a yellow legal pad covered in neat handwriting. I've been researching Marcus Steinfeld's recent cases, and I'm seeing some disturbing patterns. Expert witnesses who later retracted their testimony, psychological evaluations that were never properly conducted, and financial arrangements that border on extortion. My heart started beating faster. What kind of financial arrangements? Contingency fees that are actually bribes, bonus payments that depend on specific outcomes, and in one case, an attorney who demanded payment from both sides of an inheritance dispute. Sarah's expression grew serious. Has Steinfeld contacted you directly about any kind of private arrangement? I told her about the phone call, watching her take detailed notes and occasionally mutter what sounded like legal curses under her breath. That's textbook extortion, she said finally, and it gives us leverage we didn't have before. But first, we need to understand exactly what evidence your parents think they have against you. Over the next 2 hours, Sarah walked me through every document Steinfeld had filed, explaining the legal terminology and helping me understand how they'd constructed their case. These psychological evaluations are completely fabricated, she confirmed. I contacted all 3 doctors yesterday evening. 2 of them never met you, and the third admits he was paid to write a report based entirely on information your parents provided. Can we prove that in court? Absolutely, but that's not even our strongest evidence. Sarah's eyes sparkled with the satisfaction of someone who'd uncovered a crucial piece of information. Tell me about your grandmother's final months at the nursing home. I described my weekly visits, Eleanor's sharp mind despite her physical frailty, and the conversations we'd shared about family, money, and justice. Did she ever record any conversations with your parents? My breath caught. How did you know about that? Sarah pulled out her phone and showed me a legal document I'd never seen before. Your grandmother's estate lawyer contacted me this morning. Apparently, Eleanor Morrison left detailed instructions that these recordings should be released if anyone challenged your inheritance through legal action. The recording quality was surprisingly clear. Eleanor had hidden her smartphone behind a flower arrangement, capturing hours of conversations with David and Patricia that revealed the depths of their greed and callousness. "She's costing us $800 a month more than necessary," my father's voice said clearly. "There are state facilities that would be perfectly adequate." "The sooner she's moved, the sooner she'll decline," my mother added. "These expensive places just keep people alive longer than they need to be." Sarah and I listened to conversation after conversation that painted a devastating picture of elder abuse, financial manipulation, and complete disregard for Eleanor's well-being. But the most damaging recording had been made just 2 weeks before Eleanor's death, when my parents visited with documents they clearly expected her to sign without reading. "We need you to update your will," David said in the recording. "Lorna isn't capable of handling significant responsibility. She's never held a stable job, never maintained a serious relationship, and she's developed some concerning behaviors that worry us." Eleanor's voice was weak but firm. "What kind of concerning behaviors?" "Gambling problems." Patricia lied smoothly. "She's been hiding debts from us, and we're worried she'll waste your inheritance on risky investments or frivolous spending." "I see," Eleanor replied, her tone giving away nothing. "And you believe Ryan would be a more responsible choice." "Ryan has proven himself," David continued. "He's married, stable, successful in business. He understands the value of money and the importance of family legacy." What my parents didn't realize was that Eleanor had already learned the truth about my identity as Laura Chen Morrison. She'd connected the dots between my unexplained 5-year absence and the pharmaceutical whistleblowing case that had dominated national news. "Before I make any changes," Eleanor's recorded voice said carefully, "I want to understand Lorna's situation better. Has she ever been formally diagnosed with these gambling problems you're describing?" The pause on the recording stretched uncomfortably long before my mother replied, "Well, no formal diagnosis, but her behavior patterns are quite obvious to us." "I see," Eleanor said again. "And these debts you mentioned, how much money are we talking about?" Another pause. "We don't have exact figures," David admitted, "but we're concerned about the trend." Sarah stopped the recording and looked at me with something approaching awe. "Your grandmother was brilliant. She got them to admit on tape that they had no evidence for any of their claims about you. But the recordings contained even more devastating material. Hours of David and Patricia discussing how they'd forge Eleanor's signature on insurance documents, how they'd convince doctors that she was mentally incompetent, and how they'd finally get rid of that worthless daughter once they controlled the inheritance. "There's enough evidence here to file elder abuse charges," Sarah explained. "But that's not even the most shocking part." She pulled out another document that made my hands shake as I read it. "Your grandmother discovered that your parents have been embezzling money from your brother's trust fund, falsifying business expenses, and hiding assets to avoid tax obligations. She hired a private investigator who documented everything. The financial fraud was extensive and sophisticated. David had been systematically stealing from Ryan's college fund for over 3 years, replacing the money with forged bank statements that showed healthy account balances. Patricia had been claiming personal expenses as business deductions, including vacations, jewelry, and home renovations that had nothing to do with her real estate work. They're facing potential federal charges that could result in 20 years in prison," Sarah continued. "Your inheritance lawsuit is actually a desperate attempt to get money they need to pay back what they've stolen before anyone discovers their crimes." The pieces were falling into place with devastating clarity. My parents weren't just greedy, they were criminals who'd been stealing money for years and counting on Eleanor's inheritance to cover their tracks. "But there's one more surprise," Sarah said, her voice carrying barely contained excitement. "I spent yesterday evening researching your background, and I think I know why Judge Harrison reacted the way he did when he saw you." My carefully constructed new identity was about to collide with my past in ways I'd never anticipated. The question was whether revealing the truth about Laura Chen Morrison would save my inheritance or destroy the quiet life I'd worked so hard to build. But looking at Sarah's determined expression and listening to Eleanor's recorded voice defending me against my parents' lies, I realized that some secrets were meant to be revealed. Eleanor had spent her final months gathering evidence not just to protect my inheritance, but to expose the corruption that had been poisoning our family for years. The battle was about to shift dramatically in my favor, but the war was far from over. Marcus Steinfeld and my parents had no idea what kind of evidence they were facing or how thoroughly their own greed was about to backfire in the most spectacular way possible. As the evidence mounted against them, David and Patricia's confidence began cracking like expensive makeup under hot lights. I watched them through the courthouse windows as they stood in the parking lot, arguing with increasingly frantic gestures, while Marcus Steinfeld paced nearby, his phone pressed to his ear in what appeared to be a series of desperate calls. Sarah had spent the previous evening filing motion after motion, each one more devastating than the last. The fabricated psychological evaluations, the recorded conversations, and the evidence of financial fraud had transformed their sure-thing inheritance grab into a potential criminal disaster. "They're panicking," Sarah observed, watching my parents through the window. "People make stupid mistakes when they're desperate, and your parents are about to become very stupid very quickly." She was right. Over the next 48 hours, David and Patricia embarked on a campaign of bribery and intimidation that would have impressed organized crime bosses with its brazen illegality. First, they approached the courthouse clerk with an envelope containing $5,000 in cash, asking her to accidentally lose some of the evidence Sarah had filed. The clerk, a woman named Dorothy Williams, who'd worked in the justice system for 30 years, immediately reported the attempted bribe to courthouse security. Then they tried to intimidate Sarah directly. Patricia showed up at her office unannounced, offering her a $50,000 consulting fee if she'd withdraw from my case. When Sarah refused and threatened to call security, my mother switched tactics. "You don't understand what you're dealing with," Patricia said, her voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "My husband has connections throughout this city. One phone call from him could end your career permanently. Is defending that pathetic girl really worth destroying your future?" Sarah had recorded the entire conversation on her phone, adding witness intimidation to the growing list of charges my parents were accumulating. But their most desperate move came on a Thursday afternoon when Ryan arrived at the courthouse unexpectedly. I hadn't seen my brother in over 2 years, and my first assumption was that he'd come to support our parents' case against me. Ryan Morrison had always been everything our parents wanted: tall, handsome, successful, and completely devoted to their vision of family excellence. His wedding 3 years earlier had been a social event that cost more than most people's houses with Patricia, orchestrating every detail to showcase their family's prosperity and status. I braced myself for another painful reminder of how thoroughly I disappointed the Morrison family expectations. But when Ryan walked into the courthouse conference room where Sarah and I were preparing for the next day's hearing, his expression was nothing like what I'd expected. "Lorna," he said quietly, his voice heavy with something that sounded remarkably like shame. "I need to talk to you about what our parents have been doing." He looked exhausted, older than his 32 years, with the kind of stress lines around his eyes that come from sleepless nights and impossible decisions. "I don't understand," I replied carefully. Ryan sat down across from us and pulled out a folder thick with bank statements, legal documents, and photocopied checks. "I've been investigating our family's finances for the past 6 months. I discovered some things that I think you need to know." Sarah leaned forward, her attorney instincts immediately engaged. "What kind of things?" "Our parents have been stealing from me for years," Ryan said bluntly. "My college fund, my trust account, even the money Grandpa Morrison left me when he died. They've taken over $400,000 and replaced it all with forged bank statements." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Ryan had been their golden child, their perfect son, the recipient of all their attention and investment. If they'd been stealing from him, then their financial desperation was even worse than we'd realized. "How did you discover this?" Sarah asked, already taking notes. My wife Jennifer wanted to buy a house, Ryan explained. When we went to access my trust fund for the down payment, the bank told us the account had been nearly emptied. I thought it was a mistake until I started digging deeper. He showed us document after document proving systematic theft. David had been forging Ryan's signature on withdrawal slips, transferring money to accounts my parents controlled, and creating fake investment statements that showed healthy returns on money that no longer existed. They stole from their own son, I said, still struggling to process the scope of their betrayal. It gets worse, Ryan continued. I hired a private investigator to trace where the money went. They've been using it to cover gambling debts that Dad accumulated over the past 5 years. The irony was staggering. They'd accused me of gambling problems while my father had been secretly losing hundreds of thousands of dollars at casinos throughout Georgia and Florida. Patricia doesn't know about the gambling, Ryan explained. She thinks they've been making bad investments, but Dad has been flying to Las Vegas twice a month for 3 years, staying in high-roller suites and betting amounts that could have bought houses. Sarah's pen was moving rapidly across her legal pad. This explains their desperation about the inheritance. They need Lorna's $10 million to replace the money they've stolen from you. Ryan nodded grimly. But there's more. I also discovered that they've been planning this lawsuit for months, ever since they learned about Grandma Eleanor's will. They've paid Marcus Steinfeld over $200,000, already money they stole from my accounts. Why are you telling us this? I asked, genuinely confused about his motivations. My brother looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something that might have been respect mixed with regret. Because I've spent the last 2 days listening to recordings that Sarah's team provided to law enforcement. I heard our parents planning to abuse an elderly woman who loved us. I heard them plotting to steal money from someone who never hurt anyone. And I heard them talking about their worthless daughter in ways that made me sick to my stomach. He paused, his voice becoming thick with emotion. Lorna, I know our parents treated you terribly growing up. I was so focused on their approval that I never stood up for you when I should have. I let them make you feel worthless when the truth is, you're the only one in this family who turned out to be a decent human being. Sarah and I exchanged glances, both of us recognizing the significance of what was happening. I want to testify against them, Ryan said firmly. I want to provide evidence of their financial crimes, their elder abuse, and their systematic lies about your character. They don't deserve to get away with any of this. Ryan, I said carefully, testifying against them could destroy your relationship with our parents permanently. His laugh was bitter but determined. They destroyed our relationship the moment they decided to steal from me to fund their attack on you. I'm done being their golden child if it means watching them hurt innocent people. As we talked through the implications of Ryan's testimony, I realized that Eleanor's plan had been even more sophisticated than I'd understood. She'd known that eventually the truth about our parents' character would come to light, and she'd positioned her will to ensure that justice would be served when it did. But the most shocking revelations were still to come. Ryan's investigation had uncovered evidence that would transform this inheritance dispute into a federal criminal case, and my parents had no idea how thoroughly their desperation had exposed them to prosecution that could send them to prison for decades. The golden child they'd pampered and spoiled for 30 years was about to become the witness who destroyed them. And the daughter they'd dismissed as worthless was about to be vindicated in ways that would shock everyone involved in this case. The courtroom drama was about to become something far more significant than a simple inheritance dispute. It was becoming a reckoning that had been decades in the making. The final hearing began on a crisp October morning with the kind of tension that makes even seasoned court reporters pause in their typing. Marcus Steinfeld had arrived with 3 additional attorneys, clearly recognizing that his case had spiraled far beyond a simple inheritance challenge into something resembling a criminal defense. But the morning's first surprise came from an unexpected source. Ladies and gentlemen, Judge Harrison announced, I need to address a potential conflict of interest that has come to my attention. After reviewing this case more thoroughly, I've discovered that I have prior knowledge of one of the parties that could compromise my objectivity. My parents exchanged confused glances. Steinfeld leaned forward, sensing an opportunity to delay proceedings that were clearly going against his clients. "Your Honor," he said, "if there's any question about judicial bias, perhaps we should request a continuance to allow for proper review of these conflicts." Judge Harrison's smile was enigmatic. "Mr. Steinfeld, I don't believe a continuance will be necessary. I'm recusing myself from this case and requesting that Judge Maria Santos take over these proceedings." The courtroom doors opened and a woman in her 50s entered with the kind of presence that immediately commanded attention. Judge Santos had silver-streaked hair, sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and a reputation throughout Georgia for handling complex cases involving financial crimes and elder abuse. "Your Honor." "Patricia," said her voice carrying a note of panic, "we object to this irregular change in judicial oversight." Judge Santos settled into the bench with the efficiency of someone who'd handled far more complicated situations than inheritance disputes. "Mrs. Morrison, judicial recusal is a standard procedure designed to ensure fairness. Your objection is noted but overruled." Sarah leaned over to whisper in my ear, "This is actually perfect for us. Santos specializes in exactly the kind of crimes your parents have been committing." Judge Santos reviewed the case files with impressive speed, occasionally asking clarifying questions about evidence and testimony. After 30 minutes, she looked up with the expression of someone who'd seen similar cases before. "Before we proceed with inheritance matters," she announced, "I need to address some serious allegations that have come to light during this proceeding. Mr. and Mrs. Morrison, you're facing potential federal charges for elder abuse fraud and attempted bribery of court officials." The color drained from my father's face so quickly that I thought he might faint. Patricia gripped the edge of the table with white knuckles, her diamond rings catching the courtroom lights as her hands shook. "Your Honor," Steinfeld said desperately, "my clients are here to address inheritance matters, not criminal allegations." "Mr. Steinfeld, your clients are here because they filed a lawsuit based on fabricated evidence while simultaneously committing multiple felonies. This court takes such matters very seriously." Judge Santos gestured toward the back of the courtroom, and I turned to see 2 FBI agents in dark suits standing near the entrance. Special Agent Rebecca Torres and Special Agent Michael Chen had been investigating financial crimes related to elder abuse, and Ryan's evidence had connected perfectly with their ongoing investigation. "Mr. and Mrs. Morrison," Agent Torres announced, "you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, elder abuse, and attempted bribery of federal officials." The chaos that followed was unlike anything I'd ever witnessed. Patricia began crying hysterically, her carefully applied makeup streaming down her cheeks as she protested her innocence. David sat in stunned silence, apparently unable to process that his carefully planned theft had collapsed so spectacularly. "This is impossible," Patricia sobbed. "We're respectable people. We're pillars of our community. You can't arrest us based on lies from a disturbed daughter and fabricated evidence." Agent Chen stepped forward with handcuffs, his voice calm and professional. "Ma'am, you're being arrested based on recorded confessions, documented financial fraud, and attempted bribery that was witnessed by multiple court officials." Steinfeld was frantically packing his briefcase, clearly trying to distance himself from clients who'd just become radioactive to his career. "Your Honor, I request permission to withdraw from representing these defendants." "Permission granted," Judge Santos replied dryly. "Mr. Steinfeld, you'll also need to make yourself available for questioning regarding your own conduct in this matter." The celebrity lawyer's face went pale as he realized that his attempted extortion of me had been recorded and reported to the State Bar Association. His legendary career was about to end in disgrace, destroyed by his own greed and overconfidence. As the FBI agents led my parents away in handcuffs, Ryan stood up from the gallery where he'd been sitting quietly throughout the proceedings. "Your Honor," He said, "I have additional evidence regarding my parents' financial crimes that might be relevant to federal prosecution." Judge Santos nodded approvingly. "Mr. Morrison, your cooperation with law enforcement has been noted and appreciated." With my parents gone and their lawyer in disgrace, the inheritance hearing proceeded with remarkable efficiency. Sarah presented Eleanor's will, the recordings that proved her mental competency, and the evidence of my parents' fraudulent claims about my character. "Miss Morrison," Judge Santos said, "not only do I find no evidence supporting claims about your mental incompetency, I'm impressed by the courage and integrity you've demonstrated throughout this ordeal." She paused, consulting notes that Judge Harrison had left for her review. "Furthermore, this court has learned that you are actually Laura Chen Morrison, the pharmaceutical industry whistleblower, whose testimony before Congress resulted in the conviction of dozens of corporate executives for endangering public health." The revelation sent murmurs through the packed courtroom. Local news reporters who'd initially come to cover a routine inheritance dispute suddenly realized they were witnessing something much more significant. "Miss Morrison," Judge Santos continued, "your willingness to risk your own safety to protect patients from dangerous medications demonstrates exactly the kind of character and judgment that qualifies someone to manage substantial financial assets responsibly." The irony was perfect. My parents had sued me, claiming I was mentally incompetent, only to discover that I'd already proven my competency under the most demanding circumstances possible. "This court not only upholds Miss Morrison's inheritance," Judge Santos announced, "but also awards her an additional $5 million in punitive damages from assets that Mr. and Mrs. Morrison attempted to conceal from tax authorities." The hidden clause in Eleanor's will had worked exactly as my grandmother had planned. By challenging my inheritance, my parents had forfeited their own separate bequests. But Judge Santos had gone further, confiscating money they'd hidden in offshore accounts and Swiss banks. "Furthermore," she continued, "Mr. and Mrs. Morrison will be required to repay the $400,000 they stole from their son's trust accounts with interest and penalties." Ryan would get his money back, my parents would spend decades in federal prison, and I would inherit enough money to build the kind of life Eleanor had always wanted me to have. But the most satisfying moment came when Judge Santos addressed the broader implications of the case. This court has rarely seen such a clear example of justice being served through the careful planning of someone who understood the true character of everyone involved. Eleanor Morrison's will wasn't just a distribution of assets, it was a test of character that revealed the truth about each member of her family. As the hearing concluded and reporters rushed to ask questions about the pharmaceutical connection, I realized that Eleanor's final gift hadn't been money at all. It had been the opportunity to prove my worth in front of people who'd spent decades underestimating me. The woman they'd dismissed as a failure had just inherited $15 million, while their greed had cost them their freedom, their reputation, and any chance of the comfortable retirement they'd been planning. Justice had been served in ways that even Eleanor couldn't have fully anticipated. But the most important victory was yet to come, the chance to use this inheritance to build something meaningful and lasting that would honor the woman who'd believed in me when no one else would. 6 months after the trial that changed everything, I stood in the marble lobby of the newly opened Eleanor Morrison Institute for Whistleblower Protection, watching as the dedication plaque was unveiled to reveal my grandmother's smiling face cast in bronze. The transformation had been remarkable. Using the inheritance and punitive damages, I'd purchased a historic building in downtown Atlanta and converted it into a comprehensive support center for people who risk everything to expose corruption and protect the public interest. "Miss Morrison," said Dr. Amanda Foster, the Institute's first director, "we've already received applications for assistance from over 200 whistleblowers across the country." The Institute offered everything I desperately needed during my own fight against pharmaceutical corruption: legal representation, security services, psychological counseling, and financial support for people whose careers had been destroyed by their courage to tell the truth. Ryan had used his restored trust fund exactly as Eleanor would have wanted. The Ryan Morrison Foundation for Elder Abuse Prevention had become one of Georgia's most effective advocacy organizations, helping families identify and prosecute cases of financial exploitation against elderly relatives. "I keep thinking about what Grandma would say if she could see all this," Ryan said, joining me in front of Eleanor's memorial wall. Our relationship had been transformed completely. The golden child who'd once been our parents' greatest pride had become a genuine advocate for justice, using his business connections and social influence to fight the same kinds of corruption that had nearly destroyed our family. "She'd probably say we took too long to figure out what really mattered," I replied, thinking about Eleanor's final words to me in the nursing home. The legal aftermath had been swift and thorough. David received 18 years in federal prison for fraud, elder abuse, and attempted bribery. Patricia got 15 years for her role in the conspiracy. Marcus Steinfeld was disbarred and sentenced to 5 years for extortion and fraud, his legendary career ending in complete disgrace. But the most satisfying aspect of their punishment was financial. The government had seized every asset they'd hidden, including offshore accounts, luxury cars, jewelry, and the expensive house where I'd grown up feeling worthless and unwanted. They'd lost everything while I'd gained not just money, but something far more valuable, the knowledge that Eleanor had always seen my true character, even when I doubted it myself. Miss Morrison. Dr. Foster approached with a tablet displaying the latest statistics about our impact. "I thought you'd like to know that the Institute has helped secure convictions in 12 major corruption cases just in our first 6 months of operation. The numbers were encouraging, but the individual stories were what really mattered. Like Sarah Chen, the FDA scientist who'd exposed contaminated medical devices and now had legal protection from corporate retaliation. Or Marcus Williams, the Pentagon accountant who'd revealed defense contractor fraud and received security services when his family was threatened. Each success story proved that Eleanor's investment in my character had created ripples of justice that extended far beyond our family's particular drama. Judge Santos had become an unexpected ally, referring cases to the Institute whenever she encountered whistleblowers who needed support. Judge Harrison had written a letter of recommendation that helped us secure nonprofit status and federal grants. Even Sarah Martinez had joined our permanent staff, leaving her public defender position to become the Institute's chief legal counsel. Her success in my case had attracted national attention, and she'd received job offers from prestigious law firms throughout the country. But she'd chosen to stay with our mission of protecting people who risk everything to defend the truth. "I've been thinking about expanding our services," Sarah said, joining our conversation in front of Eleanor's memorial. "We're getting requests from international whistleblowers who need protection from foreign corporations and governments." The Institute had grown beyond anything I'd originally envisioned. We now employed 15 full-time staff members, including investigators, attorneys, security specialists, and counselors. Our annual budget exceeded $3 million, funded by the inheritance, private donations, and federal grants. But the most meaningful aspect of our work was personal. Every person we helped reminded me of my own journey from isolation and fear to security and purpose. Eleanor's inheritance had given me more than financial freedom. It had provided the resources to transform my own painful experience into something that could help others survive similar challenges. Miss Morrison. Dr. Foster said, "There's someone here who specifically asked to meet you." She led me to our main conference room where a young woman in her 20s sat nervously reviewing a folder of documents. Her name was Jessica Rodriguez, and she worked as a quality control inspector for a major food processing company. "I've discovered that my company is knowingly shipping contaminated products to schools and hospitals," she explained, her voice shaking with the same fear I'd felt years earlier. "They're threatening to fire me and sue me for corporate sabotage if I report it to health authorities." Listening to her story, I felt the familiar combination of anger and determination that had driven my own decision to testify against pharmaceutical corruption. Jessica was facing the same impossible choice: stay silent and allow innocent people to be harmed, or speak up and risk destroying her own life. "Jessica," I said, using the same tone Eleanor had used with me during our final conversations, "you're not alone in this fight. We have lawyers who specialize in food safety cases, investigators who can help document the contamination and security services to protect you from corporate retaliation." Her relief was immediate and visible. The isolation and fear that had been consuming her for months began lifting as she realized that telling the truth didn't have to mean facing the consequences alone. "What happens next?" she asked. "Next, we help you do what you already know is right," I replied. "But we make sure you have all the support and protection you need to survive the process." As our meeting concluded and Jessica left with a comprehensive support plan, I realized that this was exactly what Eleanor had intended when she structured her will to test our family's character. She'd known that money without purpose becomes meaningless, but money directed toward justice creates lasting change. The woman who'd spent decades building a real estate empire had used her final act to build something even more valuable, a legacy of courage and integrity that would outlast any material inheritance. Standing in the Institute's lobby that evening, surrounded by photos of the whistleblowers we'd helped and the corrupt officials whose crimes had been exposed through their courage, I understood that my parents had actually done me a favor by suing for my inheritance. Their greed had revealed the truth about everyone involved. They'd lost their freedom and their fortune because they'd chosen corruption over character. Ryan had gained a meaningful purpose by choosing justice over family loyalty. I discovered that my grandmother's greatest gift wasn't money, but the opportunity to prove that her faith in my character had been justified. The $10 million inheritance had grown into something worth far more than its monetary value. It had become a force for protecting people who risk everything to defend the innocent, exposing corruption that threatens public safety, and proving that sometimes the courage of one person really can change the world. Eleanor Morrison's legacy lived on not in bank accounts or real estate holdings, but in every whistleblower who found the strength to tell the truth, because they knew they wouldn't have to face the consequences alone. That was worth more than all the money in the world, and it was the inheritance that no lawsuit could ever steal from me. Have you ever had to choose between staying quiet about something wrong or speaking up despite the personal cost? What gave you the courage to do the right thing when it wasn't the easy thing? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear about times when ordinary people found extraordinary courage to stand up for what's right. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button to help others find it. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about justice, family dynamics, and the power of standing up to corruption. And please share this with anyone who needs to be reminded that sometimes the people who dismiss us as failures are actually revealing their own character, not ours. Thank you for listening to Eleanor and my story. Remember that your worth isn't determined by the people who choose not to see it, and sometimes the greatest inheritances aren't money at all. They're the courage to live according to your values, no matter what it costs.